Right. Well, we're back onto the series on table fellowship, and this morning we're considering table fellowship with the ancient Egyptians. But in more modern times, someone famously said, an army marches on its stomach. No one really knows who first said that. Some people think that it was Napoleon Bonaparte. Others think maybe Frederick the Great of Prussia. But I suggest that it was more likely one of the guys that had to peel all the potatoes and wash the dishes. But anyway, it's quite a well-known saying, an army marches on its stomach. And by this, whoever said it meant that troops on the move need to be well fed. When King David chose not to join his men at the war in Ammon, but stayed home and spied Bathsheba from his rooftop, in 2 Samuel 11 verse 1 says that this was at the return of the year. In other words, it was the beginning of the new year, which in Israel's calendar is early springtime, normally about from March through to the middle or end of April. The verse goes on to say it was at the time when kings go forth, which is to say when kings go out to battle. And this refers to the fact that kings normally commenced a military campaign only once the weather got warm and dry. And this was not because they or their men hated the cold and rain, but because in early spring, wherever the battle was raging, there would likely be ripe fields of grain close by, which the troops could easily plunder for their food. Now, some of our best information about food in biblical times comes from military records in both pictorial and written form out of the ancient Middle Eastern and Mediterranean nations. In his book, Warfare in New Kingdom Egypt, Paul Elliott describes provisions for the Egyptian army in the period covered from Exodus chapter 1 to partway through the book of Judges. During those 3 centuries, Egypt's armed forces often ranged from Libya in the west and Sudan in the south, up to Canaan, Syria, and Euphrates River in the north. Wherever they were, the Egyptian troops relied on an efficient logistical organization by which they could be routinely provisioned with essential supplies such as livestock, grain, linen cloth, and ointments for medical use. Permanent garrisons and frontier forts were regularly stocked with bread that had been pre-cooked and remained edible for a number of weeks. These were typically the flat, unleavened breads such as pita or naan bread that we can buy at the supermarket or which we see at many takeaway shops. When Gibeonites came to Gilgal and deceived Israel into believing they had come on a very long journey from a far country, they showed them packs, they showed the Israelites packs of stale, dry, crumbly, mouldy loaves, saying at Joshua chapter 9 verse 12, "We took this bread warm from our homes for our provisions." So these loaves of the Gibeonites were similar to or the same as the pre-cooked Egyptian army breads. They were usually baked by slapping the flattened dough against the inside wall of an open-topped clay oven. We know them today as tandoori ovens, but that word tandoori goes right back to biblical times under slightly different forms. So the bread, the dough is slapped onto the inside of the clay oven where it sticks and cooks, much like a pikelet on a hot plate. These flatbreads were not unlike the showbread or the bread of the presence referred to in Exodus 25 verse 30, which stayed fresh in the holy place for a week before being eaten by the priests on the Sabbath. Leviticus chapter 24 verses 5 through 6 says the 12 loaves of showbread formed 2 piles of 6 on the little gilded table that they were on. So the showbread looked like 2 stacks of large thick pancakes, either kept flat or possibly rolled into logs. Egyptian pharaohs planned their campaigns well ahead of time, and to prepare for a northern assault into Syria and Mesopotamia, they routinely cached supplies along the coast highway between Egypt and the city of Gaza. We know Gaza today in the Gaza Strip near Israel. This was known as the Way of Horus. That highway from Egypt up to Gaza was known as the Way of Horus, and is called the highway to the land of the Philistines at Exodus 13 verse 17. God led the Hebrews away from it so that they would not retreat on seeing Egypt's military forces along that route. The Egyptian 18th dynasty, the one made famous by Tutankhamun, that was the dynasty that had forced the Hebrews into slavery. And the reason it did so was firstly to keep the Israelites, to stop the Israelites from going over to Egypt's enemies, especially while Egypt proceeded to conquer its neighbours in Africa and the Levant as far north as Syria. The second reason that they kept the Israelites in slavery was to have them build the large store cities, Pithom and Ramses, referred to at Exodus chapter 1 verse 11. These store cities probably lay beside the highway, the Way of Horus, just east of the Nile Delta, and they formed vast warehouses for food and other military provisions which were distributed to troops heading north to the front line. Pharaohs also maintained storage depots at friendly city-states dotted around Canaan. They had done this since well before Abram came into the land. Shechem was probably one of these depots when Abram reached it. It was the first place in the land of Canaan where Abram set up an altar. But Shechem was documented at about this time by its Egyptian name, Sekhmem. So it was probably a frontier town for the Egyptians at that era of history. A later archaeological treasure trove from Egypt, known as the Amarna tablets, includes petitions from Canaanite leaders, all pleading for Egypt's assistance during the period of Joshua's invasion. One such petition was smuggled to Egypt from a king of ancient Jerusalem named Abdu-Heber or Abdi-Heber. One of the Amarna letters refers to the construction of a fortified house for Egyptian archers at a place called Manahat, some 2 miles southwest of Jerusalem. The hill country around Jerusalem formed a vital north-south and east-west transport route in Canaan, but was also an ideal hideout for bandits or soldiers of fortune. So Egypt's garrison at Manahat was no doubt set up to patrol and guard the region. Now these Egyptian storage depots probably are the explanation behind 2 Canaanite sites which in pre-Israelite times had been named House of Bread. Now you may not know it, but you probably know the names of those houses of bread by their Hebrew names. The northern one was assigned to the territory of Zebulun in Joshua 19 verse 15. The site 110 kilometres south was only a short walk from Manahat, a small walled town also known as Ephrath or Ephrata, meaning fruitful. Can anyone tell me what the name of the town is that we should all know? Bethlehem, that's right. It still exists today, and we know it either by the name of Bethlehem or know it as the city of David. While the Egyptian army was on the march, food was transported either in clay jars, linen sacks, or baskets woven from papyrus stems, all normally borne on the backs of donkeys and mules, sometimes oxen, or they were pulled behind them in carts. Rather than transporting bulky and perishable foods, the army could only take the essentials for a staple diet with ingredients that needed to last many months without spoilage or loss of nutritional value. This included large quantities of grain to make flour. The grain was mostly wheat or barley. In Genesis 42, verses 25 through 35, when the sons of Jacob went into Egypt to Canaan, carrying grain both for animal feed and for human consumption, 3 words are given for the grain containers they used. They're interpreted as bags, sackcloths, and vessels of some sort. Funnily enough, one of these words translated sack in our King James Version is actually the Hebrew word pronounced sack. So it's probably where our English word comes from. Now, for their daily bread, homes commonly had a heavy stone hand mill, a disc made of stone to grind grain into flour. Sometimes the stone was something that you could hold in your hand, and you would use it to rub against a solid surface. Now, an army could transport these on carts, or it could be more practical if bands of soldiers carried one or more small handheld grindstones in their kit bags so that they could still make their own flour if separated from the main group. The kit could include a stone plate or dish against which the grindstone would rub and crush the grain, and on which the flour could be kneaded into dough. Exodus 12 verse 34 describes the Israelites leaving Egypt with their kneading bowls bound up in the cloths bundled on their shoulders. And those kneading bowls were kitchen appliances of the day, which included a plate and a stone, or I should say a flattish surface and a stone against which the grain would be ground. Now, water was the obvious wetting agent to turn flour into dough. Egyptians usually drew water either direct from the Nile or from beside its banks out of man-made dams and canals, whereas wells, if they were ever dug at all in Egypt, were very short-lived due to the high annual Nile floods. However, Egypt's river water, even in ancient times, was notoriously risky. Not only crocodiles hazardous to human health, but also heavy sedimentation, waterborne parasites or bacteria, or toxic algae. Egyptians could make Nile water fit to drink, but it was a long process of filtering and boiling the water, setting it aside to cool and settle, and then decanting the liquid and even disinfecting it with medicinal herbs. So for the common people, drinks were more often homemade barley beer plus milk or whey from coagulated milk. For wealthy Egyptians, other drinks included fruit juices and wines of various potencies, including an imported product believed to have been a fortified wine or liqueur from the Aegean Islands near Greece. So we may imagine that it tasted something like sherry or port. We know that wine was part of Egyptian army rations, though it is unclear how commonly or for whom exactly. You might think that wine was available only to the top echelons of the army, but maybe not. Maybe it was available to all the soldiers. But wine was possibly issued not for refreshment so much as for a pain drug or a sleeping draught due to its alcohol content and stupefying effect, or maybe for a wound dressing and medicine due to its antiseptic and disinfectant properties. Now, these medical uses are alluded to in the New Testament. At Luke chapter 10, verse 34, in Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan, where the Good Samaritan comes to the fallen man on the road, and he tends to his wounds by pouring in oil and wine. Also, these medicinal qualities of wine are alluded to in the Apostle Paul's prescription for Timothy's upset stomach and many ailments at 1 Timothy 5 verse 23. Incidentally, it's always been a question in the course of these studies as to why Timothy would have to be advised or instructed to drink wine, as wine was a staple drink throughout the Middle East, and I had to wonder, why was it that Timothy was not already drinking wine and getting the benefits from it? If anyone could have offer me any suggestions, I'd be very appreciative. Anyway, beer was certainly the staple drink in the Egyptian army's inventory and was issued to every soldier. From abundant stocks of barley and wheat, beer was produced on an industrial scale year-round in Egypt. It was deemed safe to drink, was not very inebriating, plus it was nutritious, and with a high calorific content, it was a quick source of energy. For an army stationed far from Egypt, beer could be made from whatever grains they came across in the land, such as millet or sorghum in Sudan, or in northern Mesopotamia, they could come across rye or spelt or oats, which could all serve to make a form of beer. Now, whether wines or beers, the flavour of these brews could be varied by the addition of dried fruits and herbs, so there was considerable diversity in the strong drinks which people consumed in biblical times. All these liquids, being fermented, were also leavening or raising agents. In other words, they could be used in baking of bread, in which case most of them quite naturally came to be used in making dough for raised loaves amongst the Egyptian army. For an army on the move, there was little time to halt and prepare meals each day. Food preparation needed to be quick and easy, using basic tools and simple ingredients. Now, if normal ovens were unavailable, whatever needed cooking had to be easily heated using only a campfire. Mesopotamian and Egyptian troops during the era of the 18th dynasty are known to have baked bread in the same manner. That is, a band of soldiers would team up quickly, they would quickly build their fire, grind the day's ration of grain in a portable grindstone or hand mill. They would wet the flour, then knead it either in a bowl or upon a board or a cloth, all the while picking out bits of dirt, grit and chaff. Each man then took his handful of the coarse dough, rolled it into a ball in his hands, flattened it by hand, and then placed it on a heated surface, either hot stones or the side of a hot clay jar, or just the hot ashes themselves. The cake of dough was turned over frequently so that it baked evenly right through without burning. And as the prophet Hosea says at chapter 7, as he implies, if a cake went unturned but was left to become charred on one side and raw on the other, then it was unpalatable and undesirable and would probably be rejected. A few centuries earlier at Hebron in Canaan, speed was of the essence when Abraham had no sooner received a visit from 3 angels than he hurried into the tent to his wife Sarah at Genesis 18 verse 6. Abraham instructed Sarah to quickly bake bread cakes. Strong's Concordance calls them ash cakes, and the King James Version calls them cakes upon the hearth. So rather than Sarah baking at a clay oven, she and her maidservants were, it seems, knelt around a large fire pit set in the ground, heaped with embers and encircled by flat stones. So she was quickly making scones, as it were, in these hot ashes and on these hot stones. The military diet of Egypt was supplemented with other staple foods that included chickpeas, lentils, and broad beans. These could be slow cooked overnight in a pot set on the ashes of the campfire. Then they would be eaten first thing next morning. It was these sorts of legumes that Jacob made into a stew, as you remember, and for which his brother Esau recklessly sold his birthright, as we read in Genesis 25 verses 29 through 34. So when you read about Jacob cooking pottage, it was these beans and chickpeas and such that he was using, including the lentils, which are still good food today. The Egyptian army consumed other vegetables which were fairly easy to transport, and they stayed edible for a long time, including garlic, onions, radishes, and leaves from a plant of the hemp family, interestingly. It's named Melukia, still around today. Radishes, interestingly, seem to have been native from either India or even further east from India, and it ties in with the fact that in these days Egypt was very much a maritime power. It was very widespread in its influence and in its trading. Now, boiled leeks and raw cucumbers are known to have been basic rations for the Egyptian army, though because they cannot stay fresh for long, they were usually potted in vinegar to form a preserve like a chutney. Biblical references to leeks probably include asparagus and even possibly lettuce, which both grew throughout the ancient Mediterranean lands. Lettuce especially was highly regarded by the Egyptians, and so I imagine it was also fairly desirable to the Hebrews once they'd been in the wilderness for more than a few months. Anyway, these plants, the lettuce, the asparagus, the leeks, were known in Egypt since before 3000 BC, so over 5,000 years ago. They were used for food and medicine, and they were also used as an aphrodisiac, apparently. I don't know how successfully. We know that the Greeks and Romans dehydrated asparagus for their use when out of season, so presumably the Egyptians did the same so that they could have dried asparagus in their army provisions. Recall that many of these green vegetables familiar to the Egyptians are the same that both the Israelites and the rabble pined for in the wilderness at Numbers 11 verse 5, when they also yearned for melons and fish that they used to eat freely, and the fish that they must have caught, fish that they ate for free, fish they must have caught in the Nile and possibly off the coast near the delta against the Mediterranean Sea. Now, in Exodus 16 verse 3, the Israelites had earlier grumbled that they missed being able to eat flesh and bread to the full as they used to do back in Egypt. We know Egypt served up a wide range of flesh, and some of the foods that were eaten by the Egyptians would not be very palatable to most of us today, but they would eat anything from ducks to ostriches. They ate lizards and turtles. They would eat hares and rabbits, and they would eat zebras and the odd hippopotamus if they could catch them as well. Because they ate lizards and turtles, they presumably also ate crocodile flesh, which is a delicacy in some societies to this day. Scenes in Egyptian tombs depict bags of grain being bartered for other goods and foodstuffs. And this, of course, is reminiscent of when Jacob's sons went into Egypt to buy grain during the 7-year famine in Canaan. Egyptian military convoys also availed themselves of fresh and exotic produce in foreign lands wherever they could. If they weren't stealing it, they might be trading with friendly locals or raiding the enemy's fields and storehouses. And all because, as I remarked at the start, an army marches on its stomach. Now, coming back to Genesis 43, when Jacob finally agreed to let his sons return to Egypt many months after their first venture down in Egypt, for Jacob it was with great trepidation on his part, because he had already lost his son Simeon in Egypt and imagined he might never see his youngest son Benjamin again. But persuaded that he should send his sons back to Egypt to get more grain during the famine, Jacob said at verse 11 of Genesis 43, "If it must be so, then do this. Take some of the best products of the land in your bags and vessels, and carry with you a present for the man, a little balm and a little honey, also aromatic gum and myrrh, and pistachio nuts and almonds." That man who Jacob mentioned was the Prime Minister of Egypt. He was the Prime Minister of Egypt. But of course, Jacob did not know, he had no idea, in fact, that the Prime Minister of whom he spoke was also his very own long-lost son Joseph, who had been presumed dead for many years. And little did Jacob know that the perilous expedition to Egypt would eventually give rise to one of the outstanding examples of spiritual food and fellowship in the entire Bible. While living in Egypt against his will for 13 years, Joseph, who was Jacob's favourite son, had been hoping and praying to someday be reunited with his father and even with his 10 brothers who had sold him into slavery all those years ago. It was some 8 years later again when his 10 brothers arrived in Egypt from Canaan to buy grain due to the famine that had befallen them. At this, their first face-to-face meeting, we see Joseph allowing his visitors to remain ignorant of the truth about his identity and purpose. That's at Genesis 42 verse 5. For years he had been someone who his brothers preferred never to talk or think about, and at verse 13 they only acknowledged him as an anonymous, nameless figure from the past who was now gone for good as far as they were concerned. This is very like people in the world or people who leave the church, their feelings or their thoughts about Jesus Christ himself, a historical figure from long ago who is now gone for good. They, the brothers of Joseph, had no idea that they were about to behold him. They certainly had no desire to behold him, and essentially no expectation of any such eventuality. For them, the prospect of ever seeing their slave brother again was not a prospect. Less still could they imagine being glad at the prospect. Yet Joseph was not put off, and he interacted with them even in spite of their preconceptions. Appreciate that for a long time Joseph was careful not to betray his identity because they didn't recognize him and they were speaking with one another through an interpreter. Now at Genesis 43:15, when Joseph's brothers came to Egypt a second time and stood before him again, his true identity was still unknown to them. It would remain undisclosed until he finally chose to reveal himself as their brother the following day at chapter 45. But he had already planned for that possibility, and by the morning of this, their second visit, he had already begun his preparations. Now, it's important to recall that on the morning in question, each of Joseph's 10 culpable brothers was basically a carnal, worldly man, hardly better than when he had treated Joseph so monstrously 22 years ago by capturing him, throwing him into a pit, and then eventually selling him to traders. We know that for all intents and purposes, Joseph was dead to these men, but that they were all still haunted to some degree by guilt, regret, fear of their sins being found out, and were also haunted by recriminations among each other and the accusations that went back and forth between several of the brothers as to who was most responsible for what they had done. Yet in all those years, none had shown any moral compulsion to unburden his conscience or to try and make amends before God or before their father Jacob. Each man probably pushed away all thought of his urgent need of forgiveness and reconciliation, or of his own responsibility to confess and to repent. I am generalizing here. We do know that God had been and was even now working in the life of one brother, Judah, working on his character, and yet the record of all the brothers leads us to see them in the main as impenitent sinners. Now, Joseph knew these men for who and what they were. What a measure of his spirituality then, that he could deal to them not in righteous indignation or holy vengeance, but with brotherly and even fatherly love, so that they might be saved. Now, that Joseph could desire to invite and receive these rotten men into his exalted presence, and to do so for their benefit, is maybe the finest example of an Old Testament figure manifesting the mind and heart of Jesus Christ himself by fellowshipping with ignorant and undeserving sinners. Joseph's brothers were particularly fearful and anxious when they came to Joseph this second time, as he knew that they would be. He had prepared his own household servants for this eventuality, for when the brothers faced the first steward at the gateway, they were told at Genesis 43 verse 23, "Peace be to you, be at ease, do not be afraid, fear not." And then later, when they faced Joseph himself at verse 27, the first thing that he did was not accuse or criticize or belittle them or put them down, but show his care and consideration for them by asking after their welfare and the welfare, of course, of their father. Now, the brothers had come with nothing but a small gift of food, as we itemized it earlier from the earlier verses. And so they didn't have much to offer. In their mind, they basically had nothing to offer against what the Prime Minister of Egypt had. And all they really had was this tiny handful of food and a sense of their own desperate need and helplessness. And yet that was all that was needed to elicit Joseph's wonderful compassion, as verses 25 through 31 show us. Joseph's brothers still had not reached a state of godly sorrow or contrition for their past sins, yet Joseph was eager and ready to associate and participate with them, both in a sincere spirit of conciliation and an earnest hope of their regeneration. So even despite the low moral and spiritual state of his visitors, Joseph trusted to God that good could be retrieved from this evil, and he prepared the groundwork by offering them lunch. We know Joseph had faithful servants in his house, but the record clearly focuses in on Joseph's own personal involvement as he drew ever nearer to his guests around a midday meal that included bread and wine and an animal specially slain for the occasion. That's from verses 16, verse 31 and verse 34. Now, Genesis 43:32 says, the waiters served Joseph by himself. They served the Hebrews by themselves, and they served Joseph's Egyptian acquaintances by themselves. So you've got three separated parties, all ostensibly eating together, but eating in different groups. This was all because eating with Hebrews was abominable to Egyptians. So for all that the Egyptians professed Joseph, as their Lord and Master and Saviour, he to whom that they had to bow their knee in reverence, they still felt or believed that it was decent and orderly of them to shun Joseph's invited guests. So where it says that they ate with him, meaning in conjunction or communion with Joseph, or even as his equals, yet they kept apart from Joseph's brethren. Now reading on though, verse 33 seems to skip to another scene, because suddenly we see Joseph's brothers now sat before him. That is to say, they were directly facing him. So no longer separated in quite the way that they were just a short time ago. They are even set in their correct birth order, which clearly suggests to me what is a very likely scenario, that Joseph himself had ushered them personally to their new positions. If so, then it reveals already Joseph's desire to approach each man and to have personal interaction with him, in much the same way that Jesus freely made physical contact with the unclean and the untouchables in Israelite society. Next, in verse 34, the King James Version begins by saying, "And Joseph took and sent messes unto them from before him." The messes simply means the food. That old English word messes simply means portions. This sentence appears to describe Joseph seated at his meal and getting servants to deliver servings of food from his own place to that of his visitors. And if we read it this way, even as we read it this way, even if it portrays Joseph as a solitary figure, keeping some distance between himself and his brothers, it still gives a vivid portrayal of his eager generosity. The Hebrew word for took is one that is used hundreds of times to indicate lifting and bearing something along. For example, the Israelites took their dough and kneading troughs on their shoulders when they left Egypt at Exodus 12 verse 34. At 2 Samuel 23 verse 16, 3 men took water from the well of Bethlehem to David when he was thirsting. And at Nehemiah chapter 2 verse 1, Nehemiah was the butler to the king of Persia, and he carried or bore up wine to the king. Now, in Rotherham's emphasized Bible, the phrase took portions back in the case of Joseph is rendered more literally as lifted liftings. So it seems a considerable workload was involved in carrying a variety of different food. And we know that the meal included beef and bread and wine at the very least. But in the King James Version, the word sent was actually added by the translators. What this means is that Joseph did not send the food via his waiters or butlers. The Septuagint version of the Old Testament translated this sentence to say, Joseph's brothers all took their portions from him to themselves, as if to say they actually walked up to where the food was and then went back to their seating positions. Yet this is also incorrect if we follow the Hebrew. For the Hebrew text reads to the effect that one man and one man only bore the full load. And I'll let you speculate as to who that man was, but I'm persuaded that it was Joseph himself. The New American Standard Version of verse 34 is a little more accurate, and it offers a slightly clearer picture when it says that he, Joseph, took portions to them from his own table. And this, I believe, is exactly how it was. So now the picture portrays Joseph himself seemingly risen from his own seat, picking up food and drink vessels off his own table and bearing them to his brothers. This is the prime minister of Egypt, the greatest empire in the world in his day. It would be like the King of England getting up from his seat at a banquet and going around giving food to all the guests. Here we see Joseph taking upon himself the role of his own servants. And of course, that points forward to the King of Kings, who took upon himself the role of a servant. The New American Standard Version and many modern versions say that Joseph took the portions from his table. But again, this is not true. Table is not in the text. The Hebrew uses a word which literally means face, showing that the portions were lifted from before Joseph's own face. Is not the true emphasis then that Joseph was face to face with each man individually as he offered him his portion? That serving each welcome guest, Joseph gazed upon him personally. I believe that that was the case. And where did Joseph perform this act of hospitality? That must have been at his own dining area, the place of honor to which he had surely invited his guests to join him, maybe along low tables or upon dinner mats on the floor. It is here that they were sat before him, as we read in the text. They were sat before him in order of age, and this was where he now shares the food out to them by his own hand. And in this way, it is easy for Joseph to serve 5 times as much to his brother Benjamin as he gave to his older brothers. In verse 34's ultimate scene, it says they feasted and drank freely, or they drank and made merry. And here again, our English versions obscure the correct Hebrew translation as if they were too coy or evasive to admit that the word shakar, translated drink freely or make merry, actually means to become tipsy or to satiate with stimulating drink. Now this word can refer to gross drunkenness, as in Jeremiah 25 verse 27, but Joseph surely only let his guests become tipsy or drowsy, just as Noah became at Genesis 9 verse 21 after he drank in his tent, or tipsy in the way that David caused Uriah to be at 2 Samuel 11 verse 13. In modern English, we would say Joseph's brothers were in no condition to drive home. They ended the meal that afternoon all feeling pleasantly lightheaded, jolly, a bit muzzy, I would say, unsteady on their feet perhaps, but they were relaxed, happy, restful, and glad to accept Joseph's invitation to stay in his house until the following day. Now, at this point, some Bible commentators frown and tut-tut, judging that these proceedings were a flaw in Joseph's conduct. I personally disagree, for only good came of it, as the record shows. Joseph was an exceptionally spiritual man, even a prophet. We know that. And Joseph could rightly say the next day, at chapter 45, verses 5 through 7, that God was using him to preserve life by a great deliverance. As well as spiritual insight, he was also blessed with a keen intellect mixed with emotional sensitivity. Upon seeing his brother Benjamin, Joseph yearned to embrace him and had to hide himself and weep at chapter 43, verses 29 through 30. And Joseph only appeared again after he got control of his feelings. You'll remember that at this stage, the brothers still don't know who Joseph really was. Joseph was equally sensitive to the fear and the worry that his guests felt toward him. And so his bonhomie in verses 31 through 34 was meant to put them at ease. With food and wine, he created a welcoming, non-threatening environment and an atmosphere so amicable, so light-hearted even, that it helped calm their anxiety, lower their resistance, and break down their reticence toward him. Joseph was in charge of the meal throughout. He never did let it descend into a drink fest, but it was freed up to become more friendly and communicative. And not for the purpose of idle chatter or worldly banter, but it was so that Joseph might more easily talk with and listen to his guests. This was for their edification, exhortation, and comfort, which has always been a most important function of prophetic ministry. The conclusion of our record of Joseph's meal in Egypt is a radical contrast to its beginning. At the close of verse 34, Joseph's sinful guests are with him, quite literally in communion with him, whereas his much more scrupulous and traditional acquaintances, who had earlier presumed to be with him at verse 32, that is the elitist Egyptians, they are now out of the picture. Joseph knew his guests still did not believe God's word spoken through him or about him in the early days, yet he called them to a higher place, a higher seating position where he could have them in his company. He knew he was not yet about to confront them over their past sins, yet he drew them even closer by having them eat and drink with him. So, like so many other characters in the Old Testament, including Melchizedek, Abraham, and Sarah, Joseph again shows us how a meal hosted by God's people is an act of spiritual service. It was this hospitality and ministry that prepared his brothers for their eventual redemption. Their rather jovial lunch together shows fellowship possibly at its best. Good food, fine wine, and joy in the edifying company of a godly, compassionate, Christ-like host. Amen.